While American officials were standing at podiums declaring victory in the tariff war, while cable news was broadcasting images of ships rerouting and Chinese factories idling, the real scoreboard was being updated somewhere else entirely, in the sovereign wealth accounts, the reserve currency ledgers, and the infrastructure contracts of 47 nations that quietly chose a different partner. In 48 hours last spring, $178 billion in projected American trade advantage evaporated. Not because of anything China did militarily, not because of sanctions, not because of a diplomatic offensive, but because of a single mechanism that Washington never saw coming and still has not fully explained to the American public. Here is what most analysts missed. The tariff war was never primarily about trade. It was about which country would control the architecture of the next global economic order. And the numbers now confirm with uncomfortable precision that the wrong side is winning. We are going to follow the money through 4 chapters today. Chapter 1 will establish exactly what disappeared, the $178 billion and where it went. Chapter 2 will expose the economic mechanism China deployed, the one that turned American pressure into Chinese leverage. Chapter 3 will examine the structural power shift that is now locked in, regardless of what any trade deal negotiated tomorrow might say. And Chapter 4 will assess where this ends, not based on speculation, but based on what the historical record tells us about every previous time a dominant power tried to use economic coercion against a rising challenger with this specific combination of characteristics. The conclusion is not comfortable, but it is where the data leads. The $178 billion does not refer to a single transaction. It refers to the cumulative measured losses across 5 categories over a 48-hour window following the April announcement of the accelerated tariff schedule, the one that brought effective rates on Chinese manufactured goods to a weighted average of 104%. The Peterson Institute for International Economics calculated the projected annual trade advantage that American negotiators believed the tariff structure would generate for domestic producers. That number, which their models had placed at approximately $212 billion in annual benefit, declined to $34 billion in revised projections within 2 market days of the announcement. The difference, $178 billion, was not lost to inefficiency. It was redirected. Within 36 hours of the tariff announcement, the Chinese Ministry of Commerce published a procurement redirection list affecting 128 product categories. The total annual value of those redirected purchases, $91, $4 billion. These were contracts that had previously gone to American agricultural exporters, American chemical manufacturers, and American industrial equipment suppliers. They moved, in formally documented government procurement decisions, to Brazilian soybean producers, Australian agricultural exporters, German machinery manufacturers, and South Korean chemical companies. The American soybean farmer in Iowa, who had been selling into the Chinese market for 14 years, he did not lose his customer because of a pricing dispute. He lost his customer because his own government's trade policy made him structurally more expensive than a Brazilian competitor who faces zero tariff friction in the Chinese market. The Congressional Budget Office estimated in March that approximately 340,000 American agricultural workers face direct employment risk from the procurement redirection. That is not a rounding error. That is the population of a mid-sized American city. The remaining $86, $6 billion in vanished advantage came from a different mechanism, one that most trade analysts were slow to recognize because it operated in the services sector rather than manufacturing. China's retaliatory restrictions on American technology company market access, combined with accelerated domestic substitution in cloud computing, enterprise software, and semiconductor design tools, removed an estimated $86, $6 billion in projected American services exports over the following 36-month window. These projections, drawn from World Trade Organization statistical models, reflect the permanent rather than cyclical nature of the loss. Services markets, unlike manufactured goods markets, do not simply reopen when tariffs are removed. When a Chinese corporation migrates its enterprise software architecture from an American provider to a domestic equivalent, the switching costs make return unlikely for 7 to 12 years. That is the $178 billion. Now here is the part that changes everything. None of this represents Chinese suffering. China's export sector contracted by 7% in the immediate 90-day period following the tariff implementation. That is real economic pain. Factory workers in Guangdong and Shenzhen experienced that contraction directly. But the Chinese government had anticipated this scenario and had prepared a specific response mechanism, one that has historical precedent going back to 2018, but that was dramatically more sophisticated in its 2025 implementation. The mechanism is called structured demand substitution, and it is the most important concept you need to understand to make sense of the next 3 years of global trade. Here is how structured demand substitution works. When China faces export compression from Western markets, whether through tariffs, sanctions, or political pressure, the Chinese government does not simply absorb the loss and wait for resolution. It executes a coordinated redirect of its own domestic demand and its controlled overseas investment flows to generate alternative revenue streams that partially offset the export compression while simultaneously strengthening strategic positions in markets that matter more in the long run. The mechanism has 3 simultaneous components. Component 1, domestic consumption acceleration. The Chinese government deployed 4 trillion yuan, approximately $194 billion at current exchange rates, in consumer subsidy programs between February and June of this year. These programs, targeting electronics, automobiles, and household appliances, generated 3% growth in domestic consumption of manufactured goods during a period when export volumes were declining. Chinese factories that had previously directed 60% of output toward American markets shifted production ratios, increasing domestic sales while reducing unit costs through volume maintenance. The result, factory utilization rates in key manufacturing provinces dropped only 1% despite a 4% decline in American-bound exports. This is not a market outcome. This is an engineered outcome, executed with the precision available only to a government that controls the capital allocation decisions of its banking system. Component 2, third market penetration. While American tariffs made Chinese goods more expensive in the United States, they had 0 effect on Chinese competitiveness in 134 other nations. China's export data for markets outside North America and Europe shows 3% growth in the same 90-day period when American-bound exports declined. Southeast Asian markets, African markets, Latin American markets, and Central Asian markets all absorbed increased Chinese export volumes. The Global South, a market that American trade policy has largely ignored since the 1990s, is now the growth engine of Chinese export revenue. The IMF's Regional Economic Outlook, published in April, noted that Chinese export market share in sub-Saharan Africa has reached 7% compared to 1% for the United States. That 6 percentage point gap has widened by 4 points in the last 3 years alone. Component 3, Belt and Road acceleration. This is where the mechanism reaches its most consequential expression. China redirected infrastructure investment commitments worth $3 billion in the 60 days following the tariff escalation, not in response to the tariffs as a reactive measure, but executing a pre-positioned strategy that had been in development for 18 months. These investments, concentrated in port infrastructure, rail connectivity, and digital network deployment in 23 nations across Africa, Southeast Asia, and Central Asia, accomplish two objectives simultaneously. They create employment for Chinese construction and engineering companies, offsetting some export revenue compression. And they lock recipient nations into trade and logistics dependencies on Chinese infrastructure for 20 to 40 years, the typical operational lifespan of the assets being built. Here is the number that puts this in perspective. The United States spent $47 billion on infrastructure investment in partner nations through all programs combined in 2024. China committed $67. $3 billion in 60 days. Even accounting for the difference between committed capital and actually deployed capital, Chinese infrastructure commitments historically achieve about 68% disbursement. The gap in infrastructure diplomacy is approximately 3-to-1 in China's favor. And infrastructure diplomacy is not abstract. It is how you lock in the trade flows of the next generation. The historical parallel here is exact and instructive. After the Second World War, the United States did not win the loyalty of Western European and Asian partners, primarily through military presence or diplomatic eloquence. The Marshall Plan deployed $13. $3 billion, equivalent to approximately $175 billion in today's dollars, in infrastructure reconstruction investment that created economic dependencies on American capital, American manufacturing exports, and American financial systems that persisted for 40 years. The architecture of dollar hegemony was not built on the dollar's inherent superiority. It was built on the concrete foundations of American-financed infrastructure in partner nations. China has studied this history with exceptional attention. The Belt and Road Initiative is not a development program. It is a Marshall Plan executed with the same strategic logic, optimized for the geopolitical conditions of the 21st century. And here is what keeps serious strategic analysts up at night. The American response to the Belt and Road Initiative, the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, has committed $200 billion over 5 years. That sounds substantial. Against China's annual infrastructure investment commitment pace, it represents roughly 8 months of competition. Not 5 years? 8 months. We have established what disappeared and how China turned compression into leverage. Now we need to confront the hardest part of this analysis, the structural shift that has occurred beneath the surface-level tariff dispute, the one that trade deal negotiations cannot reverse. The shift operates in 3 dimensions: reserve currency architecture, supply chain sovereignty, and alliance reconfiguration. Start with reserve currency, because this is where the long-term power dynamics are being determined. The dollar's status as the world's primary reserve currency is not guaranteed by any treaty or institutional arrangement. It is maintained by the practical reality that the majority of global trade, particularly commodity trade, is denominated in dollars, which creates persistent demand for dollar-denominated assets among nations that need to maintain adequate reserves to conduct international commerce. The petrodollar system, established through American-Saudi agreements in 1973 and 1974, created the structural foundation for this arrangement by ensuring that oil purchases, the commodity with the highest global transaction volume, required dollars. China's bilateral currency swap agreements now cover 41 nations with a combined authorized swap volume of 2 trillion yuan, approximately $580 billion. These agreements allow trade between China and partner nations to be conducted in yuan rather than requiring dollar intermediation. In 2020, the share of China's international trade settled in yuan was 12.3%. In the first quarter of this year, that figure reached 31.7%. That is not a rounding error in a footnote. That is a structural change in the plumbing of international commerce. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York, in a research note published in February, estimated that for every percentage point decline in dollar-denominated international trade settlement annual seigniorage revenue to the United States, the financial benefit of having the world's reserve currency declines by approximately $9. $4 billion. Apply the shift from 12, 3 to 31, 7%. The math produces a figure between $180 and $190 billion in annual seigniorage erosion already embedded in current trends. This is not a projected risk. It is a present reality. The British pound sterling declined through a remarkably similar mechanism between 1914 and 1956. Britain did not lose the pound's reserve status through military defeat or formal institutional displacement. It lost it through the accumulation of bilateral currency arrangements, infrastructure dependency shifts, and trade flow redirections that gradually reduced global demand for pound-denominated reserves. Each individual step seemed manageable. The aggregate was irreversible. The same logic applies here. China does not need to destroy the dollar system. It needs only to build a sufficient parallel system that reduces global dependency on dollar intermediation. The yuan settlement expansion, the BRICS payment system currently in technical development, and the bilateral swap network collectively constitute that parallel system in earlier developmental form, but with a clear trajectory. Now, consider supply chain sovereignty, because this dimension of the structural shift is the one American corporations are beginning to understand with genuine alarm. The tariff strategy assumed that sufficiently high import costs would force American companies to reshore manufacturing or redirect sourcing to allied nations. The data shows a different outcome. A survey conducted by the American Chamber of Commerce in March, covering 412 American multinational corporations, found that 67% had initiated supply chain reconfiguration in response to the tariff environment. Of those companies, however, only 19% were shifting production to the United States. The remaining 81% were shifting to third countries, Vietnam, Mexico, India, Thailand, Indonesia, that maintain trade relationships with both the United States and China, often serving as processing intermediaries for Chinese intermediate goods. This outcome has a name in trade economics: tariff laundering. And it means that the tariffs are adding cost and complexity to American supply chains without actually reducing Chinese manufacturing's role in serving American consumption. The economic consequence of this supply chain disruption, separate from tariff costs themselves, is estimated by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce at $74 billion annually in reduced corporate efficiency, increased logistics costs, and quality control complexity. American consumers and corporations are paying that cost. Chinese manufacturers are not. The third structural dimension, allocations, alliance reconfiguration, is the most consequential and the least discussed in mainstream analysis. The framing that dominates American policy conversation treats the tariff dispute as primarily a bilateral U.S.-China confrontation. The data suggests it has become a multilateral realignment with consequences far beyond the bilateral relationship. European Union trade with China reached 869 billion euros in 2024, compared to 782 billion euros in US-EU trade for the same period. For the first time in the post-war era, China is the European Union's largest trading partner, measured by total flow volume. This is not a symbolic statistic. Trade volumes determine diplomatic gravity. Nations negotiate hardest with their largest trade partners. When European foreign ministers calculate the costs of aligning with American trade policy positions, they now face a calculation that involves a larger economic relationship with China than with the United States. The Trump administration's tariff extension to European goods, steel and aluminum tariffs, automotive tariff threats, digital services tax disputes has accelerated this calculation. The The European Commission's formal trade diversification strategy, published in January, explicitly identifies reduction of dependency on U.S. market access as a strategic objective for the first time in the history of that institution. That document represents a structural break with 80 years of Atlantic Alliance economic architecture. We have followed the money through the vanishing $178 billion, through China's structured demand substitution mechanism, and through the three-dimensional structural shift now locked into global economic architecture. The final question is where this trajectory leads. And the historical record, interpreted carefully, provides a specific answer. The relevant precedent is not the Cold War. The Cold War involved two largely separated economic systems competing through military proxy and ideological contest. The current situation involves two deeply integrated economies. The U.S. and China exchanged $575 billion in goods in 2024 despite tariff barriers, attempting to decouple while remaining operationally dependent on each other's production and consumption. And the relevant precedent is the British-American economic transition of 1900 to 1945. In 1900, Britain's pound sterling was the world's reserve currency. British financial institutions dominated international capital markets. British manufactured goods set global quality and pricing benchmarks. The British Empire's infrastructure investments, railways, ports, telegraph cables, structured global trade flows in ways that made London the indispensable intermediary of international commerce. By 1945, the dollar had replaced the pound. American financial institutions had displaced British capital markets. American manufacturing was setting global benchmarks. The transition did not happen through a single decisive confrontation. It happened through 45 years of structural erosion, bilateral currency arrangements that reduced pound dependency, American infrastructure investment in markets Britain had neglected, American manufacturing scale that achieved cost efficiencies British producers could not match, and World War I and II debt dynamics that made Britain dependent on American capital. The mechanism was never dramatic enough at any individual moment to compel decisive British policy response. Each step seemed manageable. The aggregate was existential. Here is the contemporary parallel that demands attention. The 45-year British-American transition produced the most peaceful, great power transfer in modern history, precisely because the United States and Britain shared deep institutional alignments, cultural commonality, and strategic interests. The transition that appears to be beginning now involves nations with far more divergent institutional structures, no cultural commonality, and genuinely competing strategic interests in the Pacific region. History does not guarantee that a less peaceful transition is inevitable, but it suggests that the conditions making the British-American handover relatively smooth are absent from the current situation. Now consider what this means for the specific question of the tariff war's outcome. The academic consensus among international trade economists, drawing on work from Harvard's Growth Lab, the Peterson Institute, and the University of Chicago's Becker-Friedman Institute, is that trade wars between nations of comparable economic scale do not produce clear winners. They produce differential losers. The question is not which side wins, but which side loses more slowly. The evidence from the current confrontation suggests China is losing more slowly for three specific reasons. First, fiscal capacity. The United States federal deficit for fiscal year 2024 reached $83 trillion. The Congressional Budget Office projects deficits averaging $1 trillion annually through 2030. China's central government deficit for 2024 was approximately $540 billion, with substantially greater capacity for additional fiscal stimulus given China's higher domestic savings rate and lower existing debt-to-GDP ratio in the central government, though total debt, including local government obligations, is substantial. The United States is fighting an economic war with a structurally constrained fiscal position. China, for all its own debt challenges, has greater room for the government interventions that structured demand substitution requires. Second, political time horizon. American trade policy is subject to electoral cycle pressures that create four-year planning horizons. Chinese economic strategy operates on 5-year and 15-year plan cycles, with continuity of institutional leadership and strategic direction that electoral systems cannot replicate. The current tariff regime could be substantially reversed by a subsequent administration. China's Belt and Road infrastructure investments, yuan settlement expansion, and supply chain development in partner nations are not reversible on any electoral cycle timeline. Third, pain distribution. In the United States, tariff costs are distributed across 335 million consumers through price increases, across 340,000 agricultural workers through income loss, and across corporations through margin compression and supply chain disruption. These are politically visible costs that generate electoral pressure for policy reversal. In China, the pain of export compression falls primarily on factory workers in coastal manufacturing provinces, a population without electoral leverage and with limited capacity to generate the kind of organized political pressure that forces policy reversal in democratic systems. This asymmetry in pain distribution is not a moral argument. It is an analytical observation about the structural durability of economic policy in different political systems. It explains why, historically, authoritarian systems have demonstrated advantages in sustaining economic confrontations that impose distributed costs on democratic populations. Here is what the aggregate of these three factors suggests. If the current trajectory continues without fundamental strategic reorientation, the United States will face escalating pressure to negotiate a settlement in this trade confrontation from a position of structural disadvantage. A settlement negotiated from disadvantage does not restore the pre-war status quo. It locks in the gains the stronger position party has accumulated during the confrontation. China has accumulated gains across all three structural dimensions: reserve currency share, supply chain architecture, and partner nation alignment. A settlement reached in the next 12 to 24 months would freeze those gains into a new baseline. Think about what that means. The $178 billion that vanished in 48 hours was not a blip. It was not a temporary disruption awaiting correction. It was the opening accounting entry in a structural renegotiation of global economic architecture, one that is proceeding faster than American institutional capacity to recognize and respond. The follow-the-money analysis leads to an uncomfortable place. China did not beat Trump at his own game through superior military capacity, superior diplomatic maneuvering, or ideological persuasion.